Hey, hey, cats and kittens. It's Doc Haman again, and I'm here to tell you a story, but I have a little bit of a problem today because I'm having a hard time deciding what story to tell you. So I thought I'd ask for a little help from my friend George the Chipmunk, who's right here near me. He lives with me here at Meadowcrest. And uh, George, George, what do you think? Do you have any suggestions for what story I might want to tell today? Oh, yeah. Oh, I like that idea, George. Good thinking. Thanks very much. Yeah, George says that he thinks maybe this would be a good time for me to tell you about our friends Walt Walters and Stumpy the Squirrel, who live over at Kibbe Pond, which is here in Townsend. Walt is an older gentleman. You know, I'm pretty old. In fact, I'm ancient. But Walt is even older than I am. Nobody knows for sure just how old he is. Whenever anybody asks him, he says that he's 11-7. And I'm not sure that there really is such a number, but it suggests to me that he's quite old. But even though he's pretty old, he is very spry and he's very active and he's very sharp and he's good company. So I like to spend time with him. Now, Stumpy the Squirrel is Walt's especially good friend and roommate. And he and Stumpy have been together for a couple of years now after an accident cost Stumpy his tail. He used to have a big, beautiful, bushy squirrel tail like many others, including his brother over here, over here. There he is. That's Burwell, Stumpy's brother, and he has a very nice bushy tail. But Stumpy lost his in an accident, and sometime I'll tell you the story about how Stumpy lost his tail, but that's a different one from the one that I want to tell you today. Walt and Stumpy have been good buddies ever since that accident, and they have kind of a daily routine that they go through. They live, as I said, at Kibbe Pond, but Kibbe Pond is not an easy place to get to. In fact, it's got almost a secret entrance. Now, I've told you in other stories that I have a little cottage on Hickory Hills Lake, right there in Lunenburg, not too far from the library, where I sometimes tell stories during story hour. And I love to go out in my kayak at Hickory Hills Lake, and particularly when the blueberries are in season, because the islands on Hickory Hills have tons of blueberry bushes and all different sizes and colors. They're all blue, of course, or very dark, dark blue, almost black. But they have slightly different flavors, and I love to go from island to island and shoreline to shoreline and pick as many different kinds of blueberries as I can. And one day when I was out in my kayak in the middle of July, I was parting some bushes along the shoreline to pick blueberries, and I noticed that the shoreline had an opening in it and a channel of water that ran right up through it. And so I decided I would explore in my kayak. The channel was wide enough to get through. There were a lot of other low-hanging branches from trees and bushes that covered up the channel. So I'm not sure how many people know it's there. But in any case, I was able to paddle through, and I came into a pond, somewhat smaller than Hickory Hills Lake, where I usually am. And on one shore of the pond was this wonderful little cabin with an aluminum dock down on the edge of the water and a great big wooden deck out from the kitchen door. And sitting at a table out on the wooden deck was this warm and friendly looking fellow, and he was wearing a hat very much like the one I'm wearing right now. In fact, this is a hat that Walt gave me, and I wear it in honor of him because he's a wonderful storyteller, and I only wish I could tell stories as well as he does. Well, also sitting on the deck with him that day, Walt was out there having his morning cup of iced coffee, was Stumpy the squirrel, and I got to meet Stumpy then too. And ever since then, I've really enjoyed going back over to Kibbe Pond to visit. Now, Stumpy and Walt have a daily routine that they go through, and it often involves having some breakfast, and then Walt will go out on the deck and sit at the table out there while Stumpy lies on his back on the deck rail and does a little sunbathing. He never really gets a sunburn. Walt likes to kid him about how he stays pale underneath and never gets a tan. But after they've had their breakfast and Walt's had his cup of coffee or glass of iced coffee, they go on down to the dock. And most mornings, Walt will bring with him a piece of bread. He saves stale bread and sometimes puts it in the freezer because down in Kibbe Pond live a colony of bluegill sunfish. I don't know how many of you know what bluegills look like, but they're small fish. They're usually, somewhere between 5 and 6 inches in length. And some, of course, are smaller when they're babies. They grow up from very, very small little fingerlings. But bluegills are fairly friendly. They like to nest near the shore, and they hollow out round nests where they lay their eggs and raise their babies. Walt, at his aluminum dock, will go out there, and as soon as they hear his feet on the dock, all of these bluegills will come rushing up to the surface because they know that he usually brings them a piece of bread and he breaks off little bits to toss in for them. When he does that, it's sort of like a feeding frenzy. It's almost like they're sharks. They're so wild and crazy, leaping in, and the water gets to roiling and boiling and bubbling up. Sometimes Walt will hold a piece of bread in his fingers and lean out over the edge of the dock. And if the fish come up, sometimes they'll open their mouths and he'll drop the bread right into their mouths. But sometimes when they come up and open their mouths, he doesn't drop the bread. He holds it still. And very often, if he's patient, one of the bluegills will actually jump out of the water and grab the bread out of his hand. They're pretty clever, and they're very, very good at jumping out of the water. Now, Stumpy loves to come down and watch, and if there's a particularly good jump that one of them makes, he'll chatter very excitedly. And the two of them enjoy that part of their morning routine as well. But when they're done feeding the fish, feeding those bluegills, and by the way, some of you may actually know bluegills by other names. Sometimes they're called pumpkin seeds, sometimes just sunfish, and I've actually heard people call them kibbies. Now, you might think that Kibbe Pond is named for those sunfish then, but actually it isn't. But that's yet another story that maybe I'll tell you another time. Well, after they've fed the fish, Walt and Stumpy like to go out for their morning tour of the pond, and they do that in Walt's boat, Nellie. Nellie is a 10-foot wooden dory. She's a plain white, and she has 3 seats in her. She also has a 3-horsepower Johnson outboard motor. Very, very quiet motor because Walt keeps it tuned very carefully. He's a great mechanic, and he can tune that motor to purr just about as quietly as Stumpy purrs when Walt gives him a little one-fingered nose stroke, which Stumpy really loves. Puts him right to sleep sometimes, so that purr that he makes when he starts getting that nose rub sometimes turns into a snore, and Stumpy's snores are a lot louder than his purrs. But Walt's outboard motor, the Johnson, is much quieter than Stumpy's snores, and it's about as loud as Stumpy's purrs, so it's very, very quiet. And Walt doesn't really like to go fast in Nellie. He likes to take his time and look at everything carefully, take in all the sights and all the smells and all the sounds, everything that the pond has to offer him. Now, when they get ready to get into Nellie, Walt puts on his life vest, and he puts a flotation cushion up in the front seat in the bow of the boat, because that's where Stumpy likes to ride. And much of the time, Stumpy will stay on that cushion, but once the boat starts moving and the wind starts coming in, he likes to get up on the front railing there with both of his front feet and sometimes all 4 feet. He'll stand up there and enjoy the breeze and what spray comes up from the water as the boat goes along. Now, back in the time that I'm going to tell you about, Walt used to do quite a bit of fishing. He'd cut back a little bit because he didn't like to hurt fish any more than he liked to hurt any other kind of animal. And so he would catch fish and then release them. He was already starting to wonder a little bit about whether he wanted to continue fishing on the day that I'm going to tell you about. And since that day, he's cut back considerably, and maybe you'll see why when we get to the end of the story. Well, in any case, their morning included a tour of the pond, and that would involve going all around the shoreline of the pond, peeking into some of the coves and seeing some of the friends and neighbors that lived near them, including Ralphie, the great blue heron. And if you don't know what a great blue heron is, if you look up over my shoulder here, you'll see a Ralphie sitting right there with his orange beak. Great blue herons have very long legs, almost like stilts, and they wade in the water, and they'll sometimes stop and hold still until they can catch a fish or a frog or something else that they consider tasty. So Walt and Stumpy enjoy seeing their friend Ralphie when they're out in the morning and taking in anything else that their noses, their ears, their eyes, and any of the five senses have to offer them. Sometimes on those trips, Walt will bring along his fishing rod and throw out a cast or two. And on the particular day that I'm going to tell you about, he and Stumpy had fed the fish. They'd hopped into Nellie, and they'd gone partway out into the lake, and Walt had decided that he was going to get his rod out and cast soon. But he said to Stumpy, Stumpy, did I ever tell you the stories I've heard, the legends I've heard about giant bluegills that live right here in Kibbe Pond? That I know back in the 1940s there were stories about this one giant bluegill that got up to 4 or 5 feet in length. He had this lemon yellow or some people said golden color to him, so that sometimes people would see the hump of his back and his dorsal fin stick up out of the water, and it would flash gold in the sun. And they called him Count Bouillabaisse, and people would see him from time to time. And then they stopped seeing him. And some people think that these giant bluegills that have lived in the pond are so big that the pond can sustain only one of them at a time. And other people have said that these big fish live 30 or 40 years. And when one of them dies out, another one replaces them. And so back in the 1980s, Walt had learned, and he was telling Stumpy on this particular day, about another giant bluegill who was supposed to live in the pond. This one was gray in color, and people called him Old Smokey, partly because he was as gray as smoke, but partly too because he would be here in one moment and gone in the next, the way that smoke is here and gone so quickly too. Well, I think sometimes Walt likes to try to scare Stumpy with his stories, and he seemed to be trying to do that on this particular morning. But Stumpy has learned over time not to take what Walt has to say with complete seriousness. Sometimes Walt likes to tell stretchers or tall tales, the way I like to tell tall tales sometimes. So Stumpy was, just kind of shrugging it off. He wasn't paying much attention to what Walt had to say. And so finally Walt said, well, Stumpy, I don't know if I ever told you, back in the days when I used to bring my kayak out on the water every day, I was floating along one hot summer day with my hands dangling over the side, and something came up and bit off the tip of my pinky finger. And that's when he showed Stumpy that the end of his pinky finger was gone. But even that story didn't really bother Stumpy too much. He was still up in the bow of the boat. Well, Walt got ready to cast, and he tossed his line out, and suddenly he had a big strike. Now, it happened to be July 3rd, the day before the big Independence Day celebrations that we all enjoy. And Walt got this big strike, and he was so excited that he stood up in the boat. And when he stood up in the boat, he had originally let a little bit of slack out of his line, and he happened to step into that so that the line tightened around his boot. and before he knew it, the tip of his rod was bent straight down to the water, and that big fish that he had caught, or that he had hooked, was starting to pull the boat behind it, just the way that whales, back in the days of whalers, when people went out fishing for whales in rowboats, when somebody threw a harpoon into a whale, it would take off and drag the boat behind it, and the whalers called that a Nantucket sleigh ride. Well, Walt and Stumpy were about to go on a Nantucket sleigh ride too, with this, what Walt said must have been a huge fish, and he thought might be Old Smokey, had hooked on and was pulling him through the water. Well, Walt was getting a little bit nervous about it, but Stumpy was really excited. In fact, Stumpy was so excited he stood up on the edge of the boat with all 4 feet. And that was the moment when Old Smokey decided to stop and turn. And the pressure went off the line, the rod snapped back and whacked Stumpy and twanged him right off the side of the boat and into the water. And when Walt looked back to where he had hooked the big fish, he saw that gray humped back come out of the water with the dorsal fin sticking up, and it was headed straight back towards where little Stumpy was swimming in the water, trying to get back to the boat. And when Walt saw Old Smokey coming after Stumpy, he said, "Stumpy, don't look back. Just swim to me as fast as you can." And that may have been one time in Stumpy's life when not having a tail was an advantage. He didn't have a tail to get soggy and drag him down and slow him down. And so he paddled, and finally Walt was able to scoop him out of the water, just as Old Smokey dipped underneath the boat, bumped against the bottom, and continued on his way on the other side. Well, Walt was so happy to get Stumpy, he picked him up and he tucked him inside his flannel shirt to dry him off a little bit. But Stumpy would have none of that. He hopped right out and he put his feet up on the side of the boat and he started chattering after Old Smokey to make sure Old Smokey knew that he wasn't afraid of him. Well, that's the story of how Walt and Stumpy encountered Old Smokey. It's also the story of why Walt doesn't go out fishing as much now as he used to. And so I guess we'll leave things there for today. But with luck, maybe we can go back and visit with Walt and Stumpy again another time. What do you think about that, George? Would you like to do that? George says he would, and I would too. I hope you'll come back and join us sometime soon.